Hi, and welcome to InFocus. This is Jabbar Al-Obaidi. InFocus is coming to you from Bridgewater Cable TV in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, in the United States. Also, it's available online 24/7, so you can watch this program anytime, anywhere online. In this episode, we'll be talking about civility, civic engagement, First Amendment, and anything between. Because the media, as well as the community, people are talking about free speech, mixing it with the free press, also the confusion with what is First Amendment is, and sometimes it's a mix between First Amendment and the Second Amendment. And so with me online, Professor Brian Frederick. He's a professor of political science and interim chair of the psychology department at Bridgewater State University. And also we have Professor Jason Edwards. He's a professor of communication, and both of them are authors. And we're going to talk about the outline topics, and we'll start first to ask about the definitions, or what do we understand by the phrase civility, or the word civility, and the phrase civic engagements. So my colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time. And I will start first with, how we can talk to the general public and say how we define, let's say, civility and civic engagement, so people, they can understand as a platform, as a foundation. And we'll start with Brian.
Yes, those are two large topics, civility and civic engagement. I think in general, when we're referring to the term civility, we are basically saying that we expect some level of dignity, some level of composure, some level of measured remarks when commenting on politics, where we're avoiding the temptation to inflame or to arouse someone, or avoiding things like impugning people's motives or their character, trying to focus in on the underlying issues at hand. I think that's sort of a kind of a general understanding of civility. We can get into whether sometimes civility is used to sort of stifle debate, and do we sometimes clutch our pearls a little bit too much about that. But to some degree, I think there's always been a history throughout political debate that there are some ground rules that are informally kind of shape how we engage in dialogue. As far as civic engagement goes, I think it basically referring to any sort of participation that we would describe within a conventional path, that in most democratic systems, we're trying to set up formal institutional channels where people can participate through conventional means, whether that's obviously voting being kind of the cornerstone of that project, but also being able to attend a town meeting, or attend rallies with politicians and other political actors who are speaking, gathering petitions, attending a congressional or other public hearing, would all fit in that realm. But I think we could also say there's unconventional activity that would also qualify in terms of civic engagement. Some of the actions taken during the civil rights movement, for instance, are outside of the conventional bounds, but clearly people were engaged in a civic process because they were systematically excluded from the participation in the process that would normally be allowed. So I think you have to sort of interpret it widely in both cases.
So interpreted widely, both cases. This is from political science perspective. So Jason, how is about communication?
Yeah, I think that, Brian hits on a lot of things there. I think when we're talking about civic engagement, it's really how does the public engage with not always, but a lot of times we define it with institutions of power. So the idea of how do citizens, in the one part of the First Amendment is how do you express your grievances? We often do that through in a number of ways. We vote, petitions, town meeting, as Brian mentioned, but it could be a silent protest. It could be, students exercising their rights. We've seen that on more than one occasion where they walk out and they protest. There's a variety of different ways to engage civically, from everything from calling your congressperson, which is a classic kind of thing, to writing to them, to showing up on the steps of the Capitol Hill or Beacon Hill, expressing your displeasure with your local representative or pleasure, supportive of some kind of enactment of the governor or president or whoever it might be. The notion of civility is a little bit different in the sense that that is certainly what we expect in that civic engagement. We often expect our people to engage in a respectful manner, to communicate in a way that where the focus of the engagement is on the substance of that civic engagement, whatever that choice that might be, instead of the actual, their well, we think of incivility, we think of things where people are yelling at each other, shouting epithets, engaging in potentially in incivility, upwards of violence against certain folks. And of course, the debate is the atmosphere that we're in being so raucous and so forth, and is this an area of incivility in terms of our debate, in terms of our history, in terms of the political rhetoric being used on both sides, and of course that people are accusing both of inciting political violence. The latest being, of course, Charlie Kirk's unfortunate assassination about 2 weeks ago, and of course yesterday we had another mass shooting at an LDS church in Michigan, and people on both the left and the right accusing that person of being a person on the right. And it looks like that person is much more on the right than on the left, and wasn't inspired by political discourse or whatever. So we're in an atmosphere. But one of the things that I think is important, and I think Brian will certainly agree with me, this is not a time in our history, or we have all kinds of periods in American history where discourse could be classified as uncivil. In fact, I would say that there are probably periods of American history where it's been even more uncivil. I mean, you have countless tales of people, being assaulted on the congressional floor with all kind. I mean, Senator Thaddeus Stevens famously being assaulted with a hickory cane, and so forth, and injured. But you have that's a part of American politics. Not saying that we should advocate for that, but this idea of that civility, and as Brian kind of pointed out, we could argue about whether if civility, that notion, kind of robs us from, you know, uh, really pointing out a politics, or if it kind of strips away some agency involved in one's political discourse. But we can talk about that. But civility is kind of think that perspective that I think in today's world we expect our people to be that. But with social media, it seems that it's a cesspool of discourse that where incivility runs rampant. So.
But I would say the problem is the shifting in the political culture, or shifting in general in the social norms, and how make that balance. It's not really limited for, as you guys mentioned, like, let's say students or workers, but it's really in general. What causes shifting? Shifting is so drastic. I mean, I know you mentioned, if you go back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, even 90s, but now it seems we are going deep into this shifting. I mean, are there any particular factors? Is it the politician? Is it the bad actors? Is misunderstanding? What is it in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think big variable that has changed in recent years is obviously the rise of social media. So it's in the interest of these companies to algorithmically program our emotions, and so they want us to get likes on our social media pages, and they want this sort of interaction, and they want a dialogue that doesn't necessarily uh, inform the debate, but sort of animates people and gets them coming back. And engaging in doom scrolling is kind of the new catchword of the day, where people just sort of sit there on those media devices, and that's how they make their money is, people staring at the content. And so they realize that controversy sells. And I think Jason is correct. He mentioned a lot of the historical instances where incivility has been quite common in our politics. But I think the one thing that's different now is that there's a lot of anonymity, right? So we can go online and create burner accounts, or even if we have our own name and face attached to the account, people are much more prone to sort of get into uh, spirited, animated, and sometimes vitriolic debate when they're not going to see the person. If you're at a meeting or within the personal space of someone, did at least to some degree, I think most humans sort of see themselves as social animals, and they'll pull back from some of those instincts. But the online community is geared towards really triggering people and getting them to engage in inherently uncivil, civic or incivil comments, just to sort of make the platforms that they're on successful. So I think that's been a huge change in how the political dialogue has evolved over the recent decades.
So it's this like a kind of money or profit driven, uh, or the orientation seems like that. Jason.
Yeah, I think that that's one certain aspect. I think that's certainly one of the primary ones is that, I mean, you now have all kinds of people who make their living on all kinds of different social media channels through being some kind of provocateur and so forth. So, and also they can assume aliases and so forth. I think about people on X and so forth who are engaged in. I'm like, how the heck do you have all this time for 100,000 posts? I mean, I can barely do one a day if I do any, and so forth. So I think there's that factor. I think another factor is that when you talked about civic engagement anymore, I think the avenues for civic engagement or for meeting people and talking with those that might be of a different political opinion are often closed down. I mean, the famous research by Robert Putnam from Harvard, his book in 2000 called Bowling Alone, how civic organizations across America, which were he documented were prominent certainly in the 50s, 60s. He talked about bowling leagues, which I remember my parents talking about going bowling in the 70s and 80s. And I don't know what they talked about. I was a kid back then, but those kinds of activities are few and far between today. So now we obtain our primary means of communication with most people is through either a workplace or through some kind of online community, and those online communities are often, much more redundant, not redundant, but are conservative in the sense of not politically conservative, but our social media is conservative. We associate with people who we think are like-minded. So we're not forced into positions where we have to communicate with others, where we might actually have to engage in those kinds of activities and so forth. And because of that, a lot of those connections we also make are very superficial in nature. And there's all kinds of surveys now that talk about how this generation is the loneliest generation of any generation ever. And it's because of this superficial connection. So, on the one hand, social media supposedly democratizes the ability where people can get involved, but their engagement level is, I think, at a much more superficial level, at least in terms of who they're engaging with and how long they're engaging on an issue. I mean, they will, share something. They'll see a meme. Oh, I like that. I'll share it, instead of digging a little bit deeper with, is this article true, or is this a claim true, or whatever. And so because of that, and as Brian mentioned, the algorithms are meant to kind of incite this kind of conflict. They're written into that code, and it creates a feedback loop where people just kind of get into these modes and so forth. So we're not forcing ourselves to engage with others, which is one of the great things I love about being an educator, is that I get to talk with all kinds of different perspectives, even though we live in Massachusetts, which many consider to be very liberal and so forth. I find that is not necessarily always the case, particularly in southeastern Massachusetts, which often tends to be probably a little bit more of a conservative portion of the state, which I think is a wonderful thing. We get to engage with students from all over, which is why I enjoy the job that I have. But unfortunately, we don't have people who get to do those kinds of positions and engage with all kinds of other personalities and so forth. So.
So that will give me, a chance to ask about the misunderstanding or misconception about First Amendment. I mean, is First Amendment is a kind of open branch, or is it there are some ethics behind it, there's some responsibility behind it? I mean, what do you tell the audience about First Amendment and say, well, free speech?
Well, I think we need to first set the parameters of the First Amendment. Obviously, it does protect free speech, but there are other rights that are contained within the First Amendment. Jason mentioned earlier the right to petition. That's a critical part of being able to
Mm.
be involved in civic engagement. The idea that you can petition your government and they're not going to exact some sort of retribution on you. But in terms of freedom of speech, I think the court has pretty much given wide latitude when it comes to political speech. That's the category of speech that has the greatest amount of protection. Basically, if you're not directly inciting someone to commit an imminent violent act, then you can say pretty much anything you want to without fear of the government prosecuting you. And I think sometimes people um, misconstrue the concept of free speech versus First Amendment rights. So we have free speech that's constitutionally protected from the government. That doesn't mean that we can't suffer consequences in the rest of our life. In the private sector, private employers are not subject to the First Amendment. So if you made a provocative post about what happened to Charlie Kirk or any of these other instances of political violence, you're not protected by the First Amendment. Does that violate the principle of free speech, the idea that we want a free exchange of ideas? Yes, it does. And that's something that in recent years has been much more a common theme invoked on the political right in the United States, that there was a fear that, hey, people are getting canceled for things like old social media posts or things that they had said, or, hey, this has no reflection on my job. I go to work, I do my job very effectively, but I'm being, fired, or I'm suffering some form of consequences for what I've done off the job. But now the tables have turned now that Republicans are in control of the White House and both houses of Congress. I think the big issue that sort of recently has gotten the attention and why there is clear First Amendment concern was the Jimmy Kimmel case, and the pressure that the FCC and its chair Brendan Carr was putting on the ABC to take action based on the comments that Kimmel had made. Clearly, in that case, it was a state actor, and courts have routinely ruled that is a coercive sort of approach that is prohibited under the First Amendment. And so that's sort of what's different than some of these cases of cancel culture in the past, where by and large it was private decision makers uh, private social media platforms deciding to take people off, whereas the FCC is clearly an agent of the government. And so I think that's why there was a reaction, even from some conservatives like Senator Ted Cruz, who said, hey, this is not a good precedent to set. There will be another Democratic administration in the future, and they can easily use that power against conservative voices. And so we've given them the rationale, the justification for using it. So from that standpoint, I think the reaction to the Kimmel case showed that there is still a wide appreciation of the First Amendment that goes across ideological lines. However, obviously, is quite a bit of hypocrisy where the idea of cancel culture now is embraced in ways where it was criticized before, particularly by this administration. So, but from that standpoint, I think we have to keep that line clear of what's government action and what's not. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to encourage free speech in the private sector, but citizens have to understand you don't have legal protections under those cases.
Yeah, thank you for making this point. So, yeah, I mean, either you go about it easy way or the hard way, Jason.
Yeah, I think so. I think Brian explained it pretty well. I mean, you always hear, just kind of anecdotally, well, I have freedom of speech. Well, your freedom of speech, of course, with great responsibility comes with consequences to that potential speech as well. I want to talk a little bit about the second part of that is that we often also associate the idea of press. And one of the things that we're talking about in my media and politics class is kind of this development over the past few years about how the standards of the press seem to have been waned over time, where you have a lot more citizen journalism now. You have anybody with a camera. Certainly, there's been controversy with the current Trump administration on who they let into the press room and so forth. People who wouldn't been considered journalists, 10 years ago are now considered to be journalists, bloggers, people who are podcasters, people who may or may not have journalistic training, the stuff that you would get in a high school or college course, who are trained as journalists, who work in a conventional kind of legacy media, whether that be with a television outlet or a major newspaper or something. Certainly that's been expanded as to what we consider to be the press. And of course, we have all kinds of different examples within the community and so forth. People can, stand behind that idea of freedom of the press and so forth. But again, with that certainly comes with a lot of restriction. As kind of Brian pointed out, you just can't have freedom of speech and or press anywhere you want to. You can't go into, when I talk to my students, we talk about a phenomenon called First Amendment auditors, where these are individuals who go into a variety of what they consider to be public spaces and try to exercise their rights, whether that be a post office, a library, the lobby of a law enforcement or safety complex, where the fire department. This is a First Amendment right. What the truth is, in those forums, according to the Supreme Court, they don't have the right to exercise what they would consider to be their full rights to, whether to be record or say what they want, because the courts have restricted those spaces for whatever reason as to be quasi-public forums. They're not really the kind of public forum we would see if you're out on the street and you're saying kind of things. And of course, speech, of course, can have consequences. As you can say what you want, but that does not mean that you couldn't be sanctioned, whether it be legally and or by your employer. So if you're out shouting epithets outside of a workplace or something, or you're engaged, you can certainly have that freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean you're not causing some kind of disturbance, which could then incite you to be arrested for disturbing the peace or obstruction or something like that. And that's how police departments could, or other kind of legal entities could, engage in some kind of sanction against you for that. And of course, if you say something about, a person or a business, you can certainly potentially be fired. If you are complaining about, so and so is not the best work environment. I would be surprised if you have a job the next day or something. Well, it's my freedom of speech. Well, yes, it's your freedom of speech to say what you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those consequences won't come to back to bite you in some way, shape, or form. So that's why we're always telling our students to be careful of what you put on your social media platforms when you're going out for jobs and so forth, because more and more employers are looking at your social media sites because they want to know what kind of person you are. Rightly or wrongly, that's the universe that we live in with regard to our exercising our First Amendment rights, because part of that says Congress shall make no law. Well, that doesn't
Yeah,
mean that private businesses have to they can make any law they want to. I don't mean that officially a law, but they
yeah,
can certainly engage in they can have a social media policy. They can
so,
engage in other kinds of things where they said you cannot do this and we will sanction you offline. And there's all kinds of businesses that or other entities that engage in that kind of discussion and so forth. Again, I think that's going to be becoming more. We're going to have more and more of a discussion the more and more we live our lives online, which it seems, everyone does nowadays. Every business has some kind of online component in some way, shape, or form.
thank you for watching part one. Tune in next time for part two of our conversation. This is Jabbar Al-Obaidi. Thanks for watching InFocus.